Hi, this is model shipwright Steve Priske. Say, I know a lot of you have followed my model shipbuilding online through YouTube and my website, and some of you may have read some of the magazine articles I've had published over the years, and you might have even seen some of my ship models in movies. But a few years back, I made an incredible discovery while living up in Southern Oregon that I wanted to share with everybody. In 2004, I uncovered a cache of 1,500 glass plate negative photographs, what are known as daguerreotype photographs. This collection depicts a fleet of tall ships, all built on the west coast of the United States, and for some reason, none of these images have been recorded in history books. Next, I spent 2 years scanning, digitally enhancing, and enlarging this photographic collection to see what kind of details I could discern. Amazingly enough, there were handwritten notes accompanying this collection of 1,500 images, telling me the names of the people, the ships, and the time frames involved in this historic story. Now, since posting my website to share this history with folks, I've had people submit copies of log entries by their relatives who were captains of these ships, newspaper accounts done with the owners and the operators of this shipping operation, and I've even had shipyard blueprints come my way, schematics of some of these historic tall ships. In working with the National Archives, I was able to uncover over 1,000 copies of documents related to this story, including the ship's crew lists, bills of lading, and even how much sailors, carpenters, and crewmen were paid on ships of sail in the 1800s. And now here's the most amazing part of this story. Since posting my website and some of this history online, several of the remains of these tall ships have actually been found. I've had underwater archaeological societies, National Oceanics and Atmospheric Administration, and historical societies around the world submitting photographs to me of the remains of several of these historic tall ships built on Oregon's Coos Bay. Now, one might expect after studying history books that this fleet built at Coos Bay would be your typical 2- and 3-masted schooners for coastal shipping, but this is not the case. Of the over 70 ships of sail, the records of which were discovered in photographs and documents, at least half of these ships were blue water ships built for global circumnavigation. For example, this fleet included the Lewis, the world's first 5-masted schooner; the Fort Laramie, a 266-foot, 6-masted ship of sail, the largest built on the west coast. Then there's the Novelty, the world's first 4-masted bald-head schooner and the first of her rig to circumnavigate the globe. The first 4-masted barkentine built on the west coast, the Willie R. Hume. And then there's the crown jewel of this fleet of tall ships, the first and the last clipper ship built on the west coast, the Western Shore. Built in 1874, she would be the last all-wooden clipper ship built anywhere in the world, and she actually set sailing records to England that stand to this day. With the introduction out of the way, before I start the main presentation, I'd like to point out that there's such a voluminous amount of information to share with everybody, both in the way of photographs and historical documents, that this is really an abbreviated version of the tall ships of Oregon's Coos Bay. First, credit needs to be given to Mrs. Victor West, who back in 1899 corralled this collection of 1,500 glass plate negative photographs. Then her son Victor West Jr. safely harbored these photographs, added notations, drew maps, until he unfortunately passed away around the year 2000. When I moved to Coos Bay in 2003 and unearthed all of this history, my first instinct was to digitally scan everything to save it for this and future history projects. Coos Bay, Oregon lies halfway between San Francisco, California and Seattle, Washington. It's the largest natural harbor on the coast of Oregon. By the mid-1920s, Coos Bay was the largest lumber exporting location in the United States, exporting primarily Port Orford cedar and Douglas fir worldwide. The majority of this lumber was shipped on steamships that came in from other parts of the world. However, Coos Bay was also known as a shipbuilding center, building both steamships for transporting lumber up and down the coast and wooden ships of war, used both during World War I and World War II. While all of this history is well known, it's Chapter 1, the chapter on tall shipbuilding, that seems to have escaped history books. This chapter of shipbuilding begins in 1859 and stretches through 1920. This story of a tall ship empire begins when Asa Mead Simpson left the family home in New Brunswick, Maine, with a couple of his brothers and an uncle in 1849, heading for the gold fields of California. as supercargo on the ship that they were taking around the Horn. Once they arrived in San Francisco, they sold all the lumber and headed out for the goldfields. Succeeding pretty well in the goldfields, they soon realized that there would be a much greater fortune long term if they got back into the lumber business, and so Captain Simpson and his brothers set up the Simpson Brothers Lumber Company in San Francisco to provide lumber for the ever-burning city. A couple of years later, in 1854, while supervising the loading of pier pilings on a contracted sailing ship at the newly established frontier town of Gardiner City along the Oregon coastline where the Umpqua River feeds into the Pacific Ocean, Asa had a couple of days to himself, so he took a horse and rode south exploring along the coastline. Soon enough he came across a gigantic inland waterway today known as Coos Bay. However, he was chased off by hostile Indians, so he would have to wait another year until he could come back and lay his claim to this pristine, unsettled, tree-lined harbor. On returning to Coos Bay, Asa stopped at the northernmost part of the peninsula and with an axe in hand walked up the hill and chopped down a tree and said, "This is the place." That's where they built the first home of what would become the Simpson Brothers Lumber Company. This also laid the foundation for what would become the city of North Bend, Oregon, and the location of the largest single fleet of tall ships to be built anywhere on the west coast of the United States. Interestingly enough, the first sawmill used at this facility was purchased from John Sutter, on whose property gold was discovered back in 1849, setting off the California gold rush that brought Asa out to the West Coast in the first place. Initially put in charge of the facility at North Bend was Asa's cousin, Eldridge Simpson, following the tragic loss of his brother Lewis Purnell on just trying to set up the place. During the first few months of operation, they had to rely on ships just randomly paying call on Coos Bay to pick up their lumber. Finding this an untenable situation, Asa decided to set up a shipyard adjacent to the sawmill, thus creating the first shipyard in the state of Oregon. The first couple of ships to be launched from the North Bend shipyard were typical of what was being built in Washington and California at the time, 100-foot-long two-masted schooners designed for carrying lumber down the coast. But this wasn't what Asa had in mind. He saw much bigger profits in the overseas market. So with the intention of building larger ships, he put his brother, Captain Robert Simpson, in charge of the facility at North Bend, and then hired master shipbuilder from Denmark, John Coos, to be in charge of the shipyard. It was John Coos who would be responsible for building over 35 of the finest tall ships ever to be launched on Oregon's Coos Bay, and for my money, the finest tall ships ever built anywhere. Now, by the mid-1850s, it took about 25 mechanics to build a wooden ship of sail. A mechanic was a man who had the talents to stay with the project from beginning to end, not just a day laborer or a carpenter, but someone that knew shipbuilding from stem to stern. In order to keep the most talented workmen away from competitors, returning to the goldfields or the lure of Coos Bay's Barbary Coast, Asa had the outpost at North Bend turned into a company town, replete with bunkhouses for the workmen up on the hill, a big company store, a barber shop, and even the first school in southern Oregon. At the water's edge to the right is where the spar yard was located. In this next image, we see the pinnacle of 500 years of wooden shipbuilding, men using broadaxes to shape the masts and spars of tall ships. Following the Civil War in 1865, most shipyards, including those on the West Coast, were using machinery to shape the wood for their tall ships, but not at the North Bend shipyard of Asa Simpson. He had his workmen using broadaxes and saws to build their ships in the traditional way, right down to the last ship launched in 1903. Now, some folks may be wondering how come I know so much about a layout of a company town that built tall ships back in the 1800s. Well, following a live presentation that I gave up in southern Oregon, a lady presented me with this hand-drawn schematic that tells me the names of all of the buildings and the layout. Not only do we see the twin bunkhouses in the center and the schoolhouse on the right-hand side, the company store down on the waterfront, but we can also see the houses built for all of the married guys, and this is pretty cool. There's a pavilion that was built to entertain everybody on the weekends. This is found over here on the right-hand side of this schematic. As the story goes, Asa got upset during the launching of a ship one time because there was no musical celebration dockside like there is at most large shipyards. So assembling the workmen and mechanics, he told one, "You're playing the clarinet," and another one, "You're playing the horn," another one, "You're playing the tuba," and so on. Well, from then on, there was music playing at a ship's launching. Now, how well they played, well, who knows? But we also do see the Simpson Band marching in a 4th of July parade on the wood-paved streets of North Bend, so they must not have been that bad. And here's an observation that's interesting if not amusing. In the class photograph of the mechanics building the ships at the Simpson shipyard at North Bend, we see them in exactly the same location in a later photograph of them in the company band photograph taken at the Pavilion. The same guys sitting in the same places. Another interesting observation made while digitally scanning this lost collection of tall ship images was the fact that in all cases where a Simpson ship is shown not under full sail, the ship's anchor is hanging at the ready. Now, the reason for this unusual configuration, the swaying of which could easily damage the hull of a ship, was attributed to the loss of Asa's youngest brother, who unfortunately drowned in a boating accident on entering Coos Bay for the first time in 1856. In fact, Coos Bay, being the largest natural harbor on the coast of Oregon, also has the largest natural sandbar across the entrance to that harbor. It taking over 10 minutes to loose and drop an anchor from its stowed position, many ships and lives have been lost entering and leaving Oregon's numerous sandbar harbors. I'm not so sure even dropping an anchor would save a ship, as over the years, even the Simpsons, with their anchor at the ready configuration, lost many ships at Coos Bay's perilous harbor entrance. Now let's take a look at how some of these ships were operated. Now this is the Willie R. Hume loading lumber at Marshfield on Oregon's Coos Bay. Note the ship's boat. It's suspended way up in the rigging as they're loading the deck completely with lumber. In fact, Oregon-based skippers were infamous with loading their ships so high above the deck that secondary belaying pin racks had to be added to the shrouds, as the primary ones down on the main deck were obscured by the lumber. Lumber was piled so high one had to clamber over the cargo just to get from one end of the ship to the other. Now here we see the three-masted barkentine Portland on her way to New Zealand. She's loaded so heavily the decks are completely awash, both the forward lookout and the helmsman standing atop the deck load of lumber just to see their way. Another Coos Bay tall ship, the Dare, here arriving at San Francisco, was often acclaimed for her sleek, fine lines. Regardless, newspaper accounts speak of sailors jumping ship just before leaving Coos Bay after seeing how high the decks were being loaded with lumber. As mentioned in the opening, this fleet of ships built at North Bend included some of the first tall ships built of their rig anywhere. For example, the Novelty was the world's first four-masted bald-head schooner. The five-masted Lewis would be the first ship of her rig and the first to circumnavigate the globe. The Willie R. Hume would be the first four-masted barkentine built on the west coast. Here seen in ballast, meaning she's completely empty, we can see the fine lines of a clipper ship hull, not some clunky coastal freighter. And this image of Captain Brigman, commander of the Willie R. Hume, was provided to me by a living relative for this project. And next we see the crew of the Willie R. Hume sitting about 8 feet above the deck on a cargo load of lumber. Note the belaying pin racks have been moved up into the shrouds. And then finally, a very rare photo for the day, the Willie R. Hume coming down the coast under full sail. Of the 56 tall ships built at the North Bend shipyard, all were built by and for the Simpson Brothers Lumber Company, with one exception, the magnificent three-masted barkentine Tropic Bird, which was built for a San Francisco-based passenger and cargo operation to the South Pacific. Here we see the Tropic Bird drying her sails in Tahiti. And here is a model of the Tropic Bird I was commissioned to build for a descendant of John Cruz, the master of the shipyard up at North Bend, where the original ship was built. And now we come to the pride of the fleet of tall ships built on Oregon's Coos Bay, the clipper ship Western Shore, launched in 1874. During the brief era of the clipper ships, over 300 clippers were built on the East Coast, and another 300 or so were built in England. The vast majority of these American-built clippers were call at San Francisco, and their captain's constant chiding of Ace's West Coast fleet of yachts, as they would tease him, inspired he and his brother Captain Robert Simpson to design and have John Cruise build what would be the last wooden clipper ship built anywhere in the world, and also the fastest clipper ship ever launched. As seen in this family painting of the Oregon Clipper, as she was aptly named, the ship sported 6 yards on all 3 masts, making her a sky sailor. Also, her foremast and her mainmast were the same height above the deck, and the yard arms on the foremast and the mainmast were the same size. These uncharacteristic design features were part of what contributed to her 3 record-setting voyages from the U.S. West Coast to England, records that blew past those set by clippers 20 years earlier. Being provided copies of the Western Shore's actual shipyard blueprints hand-drawn on onion skin, I've built several copies of this most venerable Coos Bay tall ship. The first one of which here you see being presented to Michael Simpson, the grandson of Asa Simpson. And here is the 4th model of the Western Shore that I've built, this one unpainted, to show off her Douglas fir and Port Orford cedar woods. I'm quite proud to point out that this model of the Western Shore was built for the descendants of John Cruise. In fact, in this family portrait at the Coos Bay Museum, we see John Cruise the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th taking possession of their Oregon Clipper. While the Western Shore would make her mark on maritime history with her 3 record-setting runs to England, she would sail for a brief 4 years. According to the ship's records secured from the National Archives, the Oregon Clipper's brief life was tumultuous and controversial. There not being time in this program to detail the shore's history, I'll capsulize by pointing out that one of the Western Shore's captains lost his life in his efforts to keep the ship from running aground onto Alcatraz Island. Then in 1878, while coming down the coast with a load of wheat from Washington State, she was wrecked onto Duxbury Reef, a well-known hazard just outside the San Francisco Golden Gate. Following the sudden death of John Cruise in 1894, the shipyard's master draftsman, Emil Huckendorf, would be put in charge of things at North Bend. However, following an argument with Asa Simpson over the proper location of the ship's privy on the 4-masted schooner Admiral, then on the ship's ways, Emil pulled up stakes and moved down the bay to a place called Marshfield and set up a shipyard. Today this is where the city of Coos Bay is located. From this shipyard, Emil would build a handful of tall ships without Asa looking over his shoulder, even though his fine tall ship specimens would end up sailing under the Diamond S of the Simpson brothers. One of Emil's gorgeous ships, the 4-masted schooner Manila, here seen leaving North Bend, would suffer the ignominious fate of being sunk by the German sea raider Baron von Luckner during World War I. The crew of both ships would end up waiting out the war stranded on an island, as the Baron's ship was sunk soon after her taking of the Manila. With the discovery of gold in the Klondike of Alaska, the last handful of tall ships built in Oregon's Coos Bay would venture north with their cargoes. In this busy dockside scene, we can see one of Emil's distinctive white-hulled schooners, anchor hanging at the ready, all loading their decks with loads of lumber for destinations around the world. Once Emil Huckendorf left the North Bend shipyard of Asa Simpson, that's him in the top hat, to start his own yard down at Marshfield, Asa hired master shipbuilder K.V. Cruise to run things at the North Bend facility. Now, K.V. Cruise should not be confused with John Cruise of earlier days. They are not related. K.V. would supervise the launching of a couple of ships for Asa. However, by 1903, with Asa's children now grown, he would turn over his empire to them. With mechanization taking over, the kids' focus would more or less be on lumbering, and so tall shipbuilding would come to an end on Coos Bay. Well, almost. Following his short tenure with Asa Simpson, K.V. Cruise formed a partnership with shipbuilder Robert Banks, creating the Cruise and Banks Shipworks. Their shipyard was located halfway between North Bend and Marshfield, about where the Mill Casino RV lot is today. Mostly they would build wooden steamships to carry lumber down the coast. One aptly named A.M. Simpson in honor of Asa Simpson. Another, the Breakwater, would ferry new automobiles to run the wood-paved streets of North Bend. Cruise and Banks would also build wooden ships of war for both world wars. In fact, immediately following World War I, the 266-foot-long steamship Fort Laramie was on the shipways, but due to a shortage of machinery and ship's engines, at the last minute she was converted into a six-masted schooner, making her one of the largest wooden ships of sail ever launched on the Pacific. Things not looking much better for 1919 and 1920, Coos and Banks would pull the old Simpson tall ship blueprints off the shelf, update them, and then launch the five-masted schooner KV Cruise. Note the yardarm on the foremast. That was a West Coast invention. It sported a large rectangular sail used for navigating up rivers. And finally, after 66 years of tall shipbuilding on Coos Bay, in 1920, Coos and Banks would launch the last all-wooden tall ship built on the bay, the North Bend II. Her name, an obvious homage to Asa Simpson and one of his first tall ships, the three-masted North Bend. The North Bend II would sail for about 8 years until in 1928 she ran aground on Peacock Spit while entering the Columbia River. Abandoned as a lost ship, over the next 13 months of high and low tides, the North Bend II would actually walk her way off of Peacock Spit, refloating herself. According to Guinness's, the only ship of sail ever to do so. Put back in the service, finally in 1940 the North Bend II would ultimately come to rest, trying to enter Coos Bay, ending her life right where she had begun it 20 years before. As mentioned at the opening, there's such a tremendous amount of tall ship history tied to Oregon's Coos Bay, most of it never recorded in history books, that I'll be posting additional videos on ships like the four-masted schooner Alumna, whose remains were recently unearthed by the British Columbia Underwater Archaeological Society. And then there's the four-masted barkentines, the specialty of the Simpsons' North Bend shipyard, each having a fascinating history, like the Echo here, on her way back from Australia, later converted into a luxury home, and then sunk while used for gunnery practice during World War II. And then there's the Churchill, here leaving the North Bend shipyard, and then waiting out the tide at Empire. And then here's her remains, recently found by the National Oceanics and Atmospheric Administration. And of course, an entire future video will be dedicated to the world's last true all-wooden clipper ship, the awesome Western Shore. Now, I hope you can see why I say that after 500 years of square-rigged ship development, these ships of sail built in the Pacific Northwest were possibly the finest wooden ships of sail built anywhere. Well, this is Steve Priske signing off until the next episode of The Tall Ships of Oregon's Coos Bay.